your life.
If tomorrow were your last day alive, what would you eat, and what would you say before closing your eyes forever? In Arizona, one of the most controversial death penalty states in America, more than 40 people have been executed since 1992, but among them, 10 names sent shockwaves across the nation. They were not just death row inmates, they became symbols of cruelty, of crimes that society could never forgive. Each final meal was a soft noose, every last word, a mirror reflecting the soul of a killer. In this video, we step into that grim world where every footstep toward the lethal injection chamber echoes with justice and outrage. We will reveal their final meals, the last flavors they chose to taste, and their final words, sometimes a choking apology, sometimes a chilling silence. The first name on the list was a cold-blooded robber and killer of 6, first, Robert Glen Jones Jr. Summer of 1996. Beneath the scorching desert sun of Arizona. No one could have guessed that a nightmare was quietly taking shape behind small storefronts. Robert Glen Jones Jr., along with his accomplice Scott Nordstrom, launched a spree of armed robberies that lasted less than a month but left 6 people dead in just 2 attacks. The first incident took place at Moon Smoke Shop. They walked in like ordinary customers, but walked out leaving behind 2 bodies, a store clerk and an innocent customer. 2 weeks later, at the Firefighters Union Hall, 4 more were killed. No warning, no survivors. The gunshots were silent fast, precise, and left no one a chance to live. Robert was caught after a stolen watch from the crime scene was traced back to someone he knew. In court, he sat with an eerily calm expression. No apology, no sign of remorse. His lawyer presented evidence of a violent childhood, but the jury remained unmoved. They did not see a wounded child, they saw a cold-blooded murderer. On October 23, 2013, after nearly 17 years of imprisonment and appeals, Robert Glen Jones Jr. entered the execution chamber at Florence Prison. No family members were present to witness. When asked for any last words, he said, "Love and respect my friends and family, and I hope my friends never find themselves here." A gentle message, meant for those outside but none for his victims. His final meal reflected the man he had become, emotionless. With no special requests, just a standard tray beef stew, mashed potatoes, steamed vegetables, 2 slices of whole wheat bread, a dessert, and a glass of fortified drink. Then the drugs were administered. His body stilled after 7 minutes. No one cried. No one spoke. Tucson did not celebrate, but no one mourned either. Because Robert's final silence, like everything he left behind. Second, Aaron Brian Gunches. A dark Arizona highway. In the year 2002, a man, hands tied behind his back, was pushed out of a car and shot dead by the side of a deserted road. That man was Ted Price, the ex-boyfriend of Aaron Gunches' girlfriend. He wasn't murdered out of deep personal hatred, but simply to silence a witness in a tangled case involving flight and abuse. Aaron Brian Gunches was not a serial killer, but the sheer coldness of his single act sent chills through the public. After killing Price, Gunches drove across state lines, leaving the body behind like a piece of trash. He was captured, confessed, and sentenced to death. But the story did not end there. Gunches became the center of a legal controversy that would last nearly 2 decades. In 2022, after almost 20 years in solitary confinement, Gunches himself petitioned the Arizona Supreme Court to carry out his execution. His reason, "I am tired of waiting." The entire nation was stunned. A death row inmate, asking to die sooner, but just a few months later, he withdrew the request. That bizarre move sparked harsh debate over the ethics of capital punishment. especially the execution of inmates who may be mentally unstable, in the end. After years of legal limbo, Arizona resumed executions, and Gunches became the first person to be put to death after more than 8 years of hiatus. On March 19, 2025, in the execution chamber at Florence, the man who once asked to die now lay silently. No last words, no struggle, no tears, not even a hint of remorse in his eyes. His final meal, a double Western bacon cheeseburger, a spicy grilled chicken sandwich, crispy onion rings, and baklava. A greasy, heavy meal as if he wanted to punish his stomach one last time before it shut down forever. Aaron Brian Gunches was not a household name like infamous serial killers, but his death, and the way he embraced it, left Arizona with a haunting question when a death row inmate asks to die sooner. Is it a sign of repentance, or just the numbness of a man who no longer fears anything? Third, Clarence Dixon. January 7, 1978, in the city of Tempe, Arizona. No one could have imagined that a case would lie dormant for nearly 3 decades, only to return with the weight of a double verdict, both for the killer and the justice system. Deanna Bowden, a 21-year-old senior at Arizona State University, was found dead in her apartment. She had been strangled with a belt and showed signs of sexual assault. There was no foreign blood, no clear fingerprints, and neighbors heard nothing unusual. A silent death that opened a cold case file. For over 20 years, no one was arrested. Deanna's case quietly faded into the dust-covered archives of the Tempe Police Department, until 2001, when DNA technology became a game-changing forensic tool. A sample was reanalyzed, and the results pointed to a name nearly forgotten in the prison system: Clarence Dixon, who was already serving a life sentence for a sexual assault from 1986. Upon further investigation, police discovered that Dixon had lived right across from Bowden's apartment. At the time of the murder, he had a documented history of mental illness and had once been declared incompetent to stand trial in a separate federal case. But for Deanna, there were no exceptions. In 2008, after a contentious trial, Clarence Dixon was sentenced to death, and then his name sat quietly on death row for more than 14 years. As Arizona paused all executions, in 2022, Arizona resumed capital punishment. Clarence Dixon became the first to face lethal injection after nearly a decade of standstill. On May 11th, at Florence Prison, he was brought into the chamber elderly, blind in one eye, struggling to walk, but his mind was sharp and his voice biting. The execution was a drawn-out ordeal. Medical staff struggled to find a vein after multiple failed attempts. They finally inserted the IV through his groin. Dixon winced in pain, but never stopped talking. He looked up at the ceiling and said coldly, "The Arizona Supreme Court should follow the law. They denied my appeals and petitions to overturn this trial. I will, and always will, declare my innocence. Now do it," followed by a curse. Then, turning to the medical staff, he sneered, "You're doing your best to kill me. How twisted is that? You worship death. Don't you? I know you're seeing this. Deanna, you know I didn't kill you." Clarence Dixon's final meal: a serving of Kentucky Fried Chicken, strawberry ice cream, and a bottle of water, a light meal, but it did nothing to soften the brutal tone of an execution that dragged on for nearly an hour. Clarence Dixon died in controversy not for the brutality of a mass killer, but for the clash between justice and humanity, between facts and what was never fully proven. Guilty or not, his story remains a chilling reminder that sometimes the legal system grows old right alongside the people it condemns. Fourth, Douglas Gretzler. In the fall of 1973, the American West fell into a state of alarm as a federal killing spree stretched from California to Arizona. No one could have guessed that the killers were a young couple driving across state lines, Douglas Edward Gretzler, 22 years old, and Willie Steelman, 28. Over the span of just 17 days, they murdered 17 people without a pattern, without mercy, and almost without leaving a trace. In Tucson, Arizona, they committed their most shocking act on November 3, 1973. They broke into the home of Marine Captain Michael Sandberg and his wife, Patricia. The couple was overpowered and became victims of a merciless night. Gretzler shot Michael while he lay in bed. Patricia, tied to the sofa, took the second bullet. Steelman later fired one more round as if to erase the final trace of life. Why they needed a place to stay for the night. The Sandbergs were simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. Gretzler was caught days later, in Colorado, in the interrogation room. He recounted each murder like he was reading a screenplay he had written himself. No confusion, no remorse, just the steady tone of a man who had chosen blood as his companion. In Arizona, he was sentenced to death in 1975 for the murders of the Sandbergs. In California, he received life sentences for 9 other killings, but it would be 24 more years before death would catch up to him. On June 3, 1998, at Florence Prison, Gretzler walked into the execution chamber after more than 2 decades of darkness and silence. But unlike the moment of his capture, he had changed. Before the drugs were administered, Gretzler looked at the witnesses and said, "From the bottom of my heart, I am deeply sorry, and have been for many years, for killing Patricia and Michael Sandberg, though I am being executed for that crime. I apologize to all 17 victims and their families." He then turned to his sister, the only family member present, and whispered in Romanian that he loved her and her 2 children. Then in English, he added, "Thank you for the life lessons you taught me." As the IV line was inserted, he whispered once more, "I love you," and then, "Goodbye." His final meal was a simple yet intentional choice: 6 sunny-side-up eggs, 4 strips of bacon, 2 slices of toast with butter, a cup of coffee, and 2 cans of Coca-Cola, a classic American breakfast. Perhaps it was his way of remembering the last days when he could still taste life. Before everything turned silent, Douglas Gretzler was no longer young when he died, but his name lives on as one of the most chilling killers to ever leave a mark on the Arizona desert. A man who began his life in freefall and ended it with the words, "I'm sorry, though far too late." 5th, Randy Greenawalt. In the summer of 1978, the state of Arizona was shaken by a daring prison break from Florence Prison. Randy Greenawalt, then serving life for 2 murders committed in 1974, escaped alongside Gary Tyson, a notorious death row inmate, and Tyson's 3 sons. What started as a bid for freedom quickly spiraled into a blood-soaked crime spree that left 6 innocent people dead in under 2 weeks. The fugitives traveled through Arizona and Colorado, stealing vehicles and murdering anyone who stood in their way. Their victims had no connection to them. They were simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. Eventually, at a checkpoint in southern Arizona, police intercepted the group during a shootout. Gary Tyson fled into the desert and died of thirst days later. Greenawalt was captured and returned to the very prison he had escaped. The retrial for the escape and murders proceeded quickly. Greenawalt offered no defense and said little. He was sentenced to death for a second time, and this time, no one hoped for clemency. On January 23, 1997, after nearly 20 years behind bars, Randy Greenawalt was taken to the execution chamber at Florence Prison. His final meal included 2 grilled cheese sandwiches, French fries, coffee, and milk from the prison cafeteria. before the lethal injection. He prayed and offered his final words, "I've prayed for you many times, and God is using you in a great way. Don't worry about me. I'll be fine." With those words, Randy Greenawalt closed a dark chapter in Arizona's judicial history, a story of escape, of violence, and ultimately, of facing justice. Sixth, Donald Harding. Across 5 different states, he quietly left death in his wake. In just the first few weeks of 1980, Donald Eugene Harding murdered at least 7 men, middle-aged victims, motel owners, truck drivers, businessmen, all caught off guard, all left behind in chilling scenes bindings, bloodstains, and stripped belongings. He was captured in Las Vegas and faced convictions in multiple states, but it was Arizona that delivered the final chapter of his blood-soaked journey, a death sentence, in Tucson. 2 of his victims had been brutally murdered in a hotel room. The scene showed signs of merciless assault before death. Harding did not deny it. For him, robbery and murder came hand in hand. His hands had once written letters from prison and had also strangled men to death. In 1982, an Arizona court sentenced him to death. A decade later, the state dusted off an execution method long unused, the gas chamber. Donald Harding became the first person executed in Arizona since 1963, and he was the last to die that way, gasping in cyanide, on April 6, 1992. He entered the gas chamber at Florence Prison. He made no public statement, left no last words, as the straps tightened around his arms. He avoided the gaze of witnesses and didn't look toward the ceiling. Instead, he cupped his hands beneath the restraints, a gesture many believe meant, "Do it. Get it over with." The gas was released. The poison filled the chamber. Death came slowly, in silence, with a physical agony that many witnesses would never forget. It was not peaceful for over 10 minutes. He struggled between life and suffocation. Reporters present later wrote, "I've never seen anyone die like that. It was slow, horrifying, and unforgettable." Donald Harding died in silence, but his death spoke volumes. It reignited national debate over the gas chamber. Within months, Arizona approved the use of lethal injection and the gas chamber was retired for good. His final meal was surprisingly simple: scrambled eggs, a few slices of bacon, buttered toast with honey, and a glass of orange juice. Perhaps he wanted one last taste of a classic American breakfast, before facing a death that was anything but American. 7. Robert Henry Moormann. On January 13, 1984, Robert Henry Moormann was granted a 72-hour release from Florence Prison, a humanitarian policy that allowed well-behaved inmates temporary visits with family. He was serving a sentence of 9 years to life for kidnapping an 8-year-old girl in 1972, with no close relatives. He spent that time with his adoptive mother, Roberta Maud Moormann, age 74. They stayed at the Blue Mist Motel, not far from the prison to many. It looked like a rare moment of healing for a broken family, but less than 24 hours after checking in, tragedy struck, a tragedy that the city of Florence would never forget. According to the investigation, during a heated and emotional dispute, Robert Moormann killed his mother inside the motel room. Forensic reports described blunt trauma and behavior that went beyond rational comprehension. After the murder, he attempted to cover his tracks using gruesome methods of body disposal, leaving traces throughout the neighborhood. But his efforts were quickly uncovered. Motel staff noticed a strange odor and called the police. During questioning, Moormann confessed but claimed he couldn't remember exactly what he had done. That statement didn't help his case, it only deepened the mystery. In court, psychiatric experts were brought in to assess his mental state. Some said he showed signs of mild schizophrenia. Others believed he had developmental neurological disorders since childhood, but none of those arguments swayed the jury. They concluded that Robert Henry Moormann was fully aware and in control of his actions at the time of the crime, and for such a brutal act. A death sentence was unavoidable on February 29, 2012. After nearly 28 years of legal battles, Moormann was executed by lethal injection at Florence Prison. His last meal was excessive: a double hamburger with 2 quarter-pound beef patties, 2 onion slices, 3 lettuce leaves, 3 tomato slices, French fries with 4 ounces of ketchup, 2 beef burritos, 2 containers of Rocky Road ice cream, and 3 cans of RC Cola. Before the execution, he offered his final words: "I hope this brings closure and that they can begin to heal. I just hope. In time. They'll forgive me. That's all." Robert Henry Moormann remains one of Arizona's most controversial death row inmates, not only for the horror of his crime, but also for the haunting questions about mental health and the ethics of executing those who may not fully grasp their own reality. 8. Robert Charles Towery. Born in 1964. Robert Charles Towery grew up in a deeply troubled household in Arizona. His childhood was marked by violence and abuse, especially from his mother, leaving him with lasting emotional scars. He was once convicted for operating an illegal auto shop and had a criminal record for theft. After serving time, Towery tried to rebuild his life, but his past trauma and addiction pulled him back into crime. On September 4th, 1991, Towery and his accomplice, Randy Allen Barker, decided to rob the home of 68-year-old Mark Jones, a man Towery had once known, and who had helped him financially. They pretended their car had broken down and asked to use the phone. Once inside, they restrained Jones, tied his hands, and searched the house for valuables. Towery then used an unknown chemical substance in an attempt to harm him. When that failed, he killed Jones with a ligature. The body was discovered the next day. The two were identified after a security guard recognized them from photos. In court, Barker agreed to testify for the prosecution in exchange for a lighter sentence. Towery was sentenced to death in 1992 during his time on death row. Towery expressed deep remorse. In a letter to his lawyer, he wrote, "I feel like a real monster for putting my kids through this. When I think about what I did to that man's family 20 years ago, I know I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. I destroyed 2 families with my actions." On March 8, 2012, Towery was executed by lethal injection at Florence Prison in Arizona. Before his death, he said, "I want to apologize to Mark's family and friends for what I did to them. I also want to apologize to my family. I love my family. Potato, potato, potato." The phrase potato. Potato. Potato was a secret message for his nephew referencing the idle sound of a Harley-Davidson engine, something they both loved. His final meal included a porterhouse steak, sautéed mushrooms, a baked potato with butter and sour cream, steamed asparagus, clam chowder, Pepsi, milk, and apple pie with vanilla ice cream. Towery didn't die a demon, nor did he pass as a saint. His life ended as a sorrowful tale of misdirection and a final apology that, while sincere, could never undo the pain he caused. 9th, Richard Dale Stokley. On July 4, 1991, the small town of Elfrida, Arizona, gathered to celebrate Independence Day. Among the festivities, 2 13-year-old girls, Mandy Myers and Mary Snyder, joined a camping trip with family and friends. That evening, they left the site to use the bathroom and never came back. Richard Dale Stokley, 38, and Randy Braziel, 19, lured the girls to a remote area. There, they assaulted and murdered them. The bodies were found a week later. In an abandoned mine shaft, Stokley was arrested and confessed. Braziel, too, was caught and accepted a plea deal for second-degree murder. He was sentenced to 20 years and released in 2011. Stokley was sentenced to death in 1992, through 2 decades of appeals. Stokley expressed remorse but never requested clemency in a letter to the Clemency Board. He wrote, "I know I made serious and irreversible mistakes. I'm sorry for being part of something so horrific." On December 5, 2012, Richard Dale Stokley was executed by lethal injection at Florence Prison. He gave no final statement. His last meal included a porterhouse steak, French fries, fried okra, cauliflower, salad with blue cheese dressing, cheddar cheese, fruit of banana, an apple, and a peach, cream soda, and chocolate ice cream. The victims' families expressed disappointment that Stokley didn't apologize directly. Mandy Meyer's mother said he was a coward from beginning to end because he couldn't face us. Richard Dale Stokley's death closed a painful chapter in Elfrida's history, but the loss endured by 2 families remains forever. 10th, Samuel Villegas Lopez. On October 29, 1986, a 59-year-old woman living alone in a small Phoenix apartment was found dead under suspicious circumstances. Neighbors called the police after noticing her door had been left wide open for hours. When authorities arrived, they began piecing together the clues, and one name quickly emerged: Samuel Villegas Lopez. 24 years old, Lopez had a criminal history. He had spent time in juvenile detention, lived a transient life. But no one expected him to be capable of something so horrific. Investigators found that the victim and Lopez had briefly known each other. They lived nearby and had some casual contact in the neighborhood. On the night of the crime, Lopez broke into her home. What happened inside that tiny apartment? Only he knows. But the outcome was clear: a death sentence, handed down just months later at his 1987 trial. Lopez's lawyers presented evidence of childhood abuse, poverty, and untreated mental health issues. They argued that he lacked control over his actions at the time, but the jury was unmoved, given the gravity of the crime. They did not hesitate to sentence him to death. For more than 2 decades, Lopez lived in isolation on death row, filing appeal after appeal, all denied. Human rights organizations once intervened, claiming due process violations, but justice, as the court saw it, had already been served. On June 27, 2012, Samuel Villegas Lopez entered the execution chamber at Florence Prison, for the first time in Arizona's history. Witnesses were allowed to view the entire procedure from the moment Lopez was brought in to the moment the IV line was placed. When asked for final words, he simply said, "No, I do not." His final meal captured the bold flavors of the American Southwest: a red chili burrito and a green chili burrito, Spanish rice, jalapenos, avocado, fresh cheese, tortilla chips, vanilla ice cream, and a few slices of pineapple. A rich, colorful meal, perhaps the last thing he ever got to choose for himself. Samuel Lopez died in silence. No family, no will, no farewell. Yet his case remains a wrinkle in the memory of Phoenix, a reminder of that October night, when the safety of a woman living alone was taken forever. They are gone, each left behind a crime, a trial, a final meal, and sometimes a final sentence that echoes long after. This list isn't just names. It's a raw glimpse into the darkest corners of human nature, of justice, and of the final choice a society makes when faced with unspeakable loss. What do you think about the death penalty? Do you believe that a person's final silence is redemption, or just the last line in an unfinished story? Leave your thoughts below. Hit like if you want to see more videos in this series. and subscribe to join me as we continue exploring the most haunting death row cases in America.